Can everyone hear us? Okay, terrific. We are now going to begin our panel discussion. And if you may recall, we had 3 wonderfully engaging and provocative talks by Erin, Shibu, and Anne. Thank you very much. And I wanted to start the discussion off, and please feel free to yell questions, or yes, there is a microphone, 2 microphones on either side. Oh, hi, Dominique. And so please feel free to go over to the aisles and ask your question. But literally, this is an opportunity for us to play with the idea of portraiture, to offer some final thoughts about the symposium overall, to offer some final thoughts on the status of portraiture. We've had some excellent discussions, I know, thus far, about selfies, about the various genres and modalities that we've seen in portraiture. But right now, I'd like to begin by talking to all 3 of you and asking you a question. And it really begins with the idea of the singularity of a supposed object. I mean, Erin, we started with your wonderful paper about Napoleon Cerrone and that image that Clemens did not like. He found it unflattering. And then it got reproduced, and you made a wonderful point about how neither the artist nor the sitter had actually given consent for those reproductions. And then, Shibu, you talked about how Matsuura created over 2,500 images, some including himself and some of other residents in that lovely county in Washington. And so we're starting to think about how a photographer has inserted himself in his own portrait studio, and you made the lovely comparison with the portrait studios in Japan. And then, Anne, of course, the inimitable Marcel Duchamp and the large glass, and then this lovely, lovely concept of the Wilson-Lincoln system and the lenticular photographs. So for me, a common thread, which I did see, but I would love to have you expand upon this. I don't know if that's me or... that was a nice little sound segue into the question. Is this idea of destabilizing identity? And the destabilizing of identity, I think, for Clemens, had to do with the destabilizing of his self-perception. Mm-hmm. And how he saw himself and how he wanted to be perceived. And the destabilizing of identity, Shibu, for Matsuura was obviously crossing gender and sexuality lines, and also racial expectations. And then, of course, Duchamp kind of speaks for himself in the ways that he's crossing perspectival and mathematical systems to broach different perspectives on one's identity. So I guess my question really is, there's this fundamental discomfort with the mimetic likeness of portraiture, I think, throughout all 3 of yours. And how are the different ways that you think each of your subjects of your talks destabilize the identity?
It's an interesting question. You mentioned singularity to begin, and I think maybe that has something to do with it, because it seems as if photography is at the heart of it, or at least an issue of volume in relation to the possibilities of images. And I think that was the issue for Twain and Cerrone, was someone who's accustomed to being the sort of singular voice and having singular authority over public image and kind of authoring oneself. Once kind of mass media and the kind of proliferation of photography makes that impossible, or it changes the stakes. And so you lose control of this sort of authority to project your own voice, but also just in the images themselves. There's more fluidity there, I think, with the objects, as the portrait objects.
And was there also just this moment of kind of a difference in expectation of what Clemens had thought he was entering into in terms of an agreement with Cerrone, and then what eventually happened? Was that being shared by other people at the same time?
Well, Cerrone was pretty clear about the stakes of his portrait business. He often paid his sitters and then sold their images.
I think it's me.
You're
Destabilizing.
So I don't know the precise situation that he had with Clemens. I think that he took the photograph for Clemens' wife's birthday, and then the issue was that the photograph then went everywhere. But I don't know what their arrangement was. Usually, though, Cerrone paid sitters, and then he sold their image, and was pretty straightforward that that was what was going to happen. So it wasn't a surprise when they suddenly found themselves their image everywhere, all over the place.
Okay. I'm not entirely sure that Mamura was making these portraits with the idea of destabilizing and the conventions. So it's our critical intervention in reading that, and at least what I propose to do. Yes. But for him, as the only Japanese immigrant in that region, his presence itself was already disturbing the norm, so to speak. And the photography as a tool, in essence, is creating a level playing field for his friends and clients to be in that space that he creates. So it's a very complicated mechanism, I think, for him to use portraiture and photography, for that matter, to assert his presence, but also being a observer and documentarian of the region. He's not widely studied, but there's a large group of photographs of the region that Glenn Mamura, that I cited, had studied. And those still need more critical attention, because that kind of production of taking people out of the scene, landscape, building of a bridge, those photographs have a different kind of presence in that era and the place that still needs to be studied.
I really enjoyed the interplay between your two papers and things that I was thinking about. And I think for Duchamp, there's no question that he was invested in upsetting norms. But something I find extremely interesting is this notion that the hardest thing for anybody to do is to get away from logic. And I think he developed a lot of strategies for himself to try to leave behind assumptions that he knew he had inherited based on his upbringing. And what I find fascinating is that although Duchamp embraces humor and wordplay as strategies for, I think, putting himself outside of conventional norms, I find it extremely interesting that at the end of the day, he also is implicitly making an appeal to a new model of reality. So although some of what he does seems somewhat fantastical, I think the fact that he understands his experiments to be rooted in a new way of understanding the world that is itself premised on new science, new technology, is extremely interesting. I think he, while upsetting some of our common assumptions, does not want to suggest that these are fantastical. But I think through this appeal to science and technology, wants us to remember that there is a way of re-engaging the world, perhaps even more meaningfully, by leaving behind what we thought we already knew about it.
And you're right, that is a wonderful connection among all three of your papers, is this very tense binary between reality and a fiction, and how much fantasy we all project into our self-perception, into our realities. And so there was a tension in all three of your papers about that. Shipu, I know Matsura, you emphasized the kind of intimacy and the spontaneity of those moments of making, that you wanted all of us to think about how we as artists, or I'm sorry, I'm a failed artist, I guess I should not include myself, how artists have enjoyed making portraits, and that sheer pleasure, that sheer playfulness that comes across from creating an image of a sitter or even of oneself. And so I think that is something to think about in your questions or in other questions. We'd love to hear from folks.
Again, it's a sign of how great all y'all's work is that I have a head full of questions, and I'll just restrict myself to one. So Erin, can we talk about the gorilla?
Sure.
it's a pretty racially loaded pistol that he's bringing to this duel over authorship. And I've been thinking about, is there a way in which, I couldn't make the connection myself, maybe you're smarter than I am, how that photograph might be imagined by Twain as some sort of like threat to his whiteness, and how that might inflect the debate that's happening. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've certainly thought a lot about that, and I don't know, I can't pretend to know what was in Samuel Clemens' head when he made the remark. It was widely reproduced, though. I showed it a copy of a newspaper, but it was also reprinted in his 1907 biography by Albert Bigelow Paine. So it was, I don't know whether it was meant to really reflect something about the appearance of the photograph, or that's the part that I find a little unclear, or to what extent we should read additional meaning into this loaded term, or whether it didn't have larger significance. And I don't know, but I do think it's, yeah, I have also thought about that.
So one of the themes that kept coming through in all of your talks was this idea of a kind of performative collaboration between the sitter and the photographer or the artist. And I was wondering, to that end, how does your research maybe make us rethink the relationship between portraiture and self-portraiture? Is there such a strong dividing line between those and these collaborations?
I think that's a fascinating question, and in the case of Cerrone, he's not. It also depends on how you define self-portraiture, what it takes to actually be the self that's portrayed, because he wasn't the one operating the camera. So was he conceiving of these photographs? Did his wife conceive of them? And then they took turns in front of the lens. I think it's an intriguing set of circumstances that we begin to have to think about, just this kind of larger play with the idea of self and how it is represented. But again, I don't mean to answer two questions by saying I don't know, but yes, I too think that is fascinating. And I think that it opens up all of these questions, all three talks did, about what that actually means for portraiture and new flexible ways of thinking about what a portrait actually is.
In my research, when I first looked at his portraits, they appear to be similar to the ones that we are accustomed to seeing. But there's one photograph that I show, which I talk about in another essay, in which he and Susan Timento, in which he was wrapping himself in the blanket, which is a tray blanket. It's intentional in the sense that they are sharing the frame. It's a pre-planned movement, right? It's not something that he just decided to do or cropped after the fact. And that's intention shown visibly through that photograph. And that gave me the clue that there was a process in which he engaged that was different from the other photographers. And I think we could, if we were to look more closely at this issue, some of the visual evidence could lead us to discovering more of that kind of collaboration between the photographer and subjects.
I agree. I think that's a really important and interesting observation that you've made. And I think over the years that I've been working on Duchamp, something that has become most fascinating to me is to realize that this artist, who is rightly considered extremely cerebral, who's known for having withdrawn from art making, actually was an amazing collaborator and was always collaborating throughout his entire life. There's almost always, in virtually everything he does, some sort of like a ping pong going back and forth between Duchamp and somebody else. And actually a really interesting distinction I see between him and Clemens is that, although I don't know nearly as much as Clemens about Clemens as Erin does, my perception about Clemens is that he's extremely uncomfortable relinquishing control. And Duchamp is the opposite. Duchamp is, although he's very, very sophisticated, and I think he's very skillful at engaging people in projects that he finds extremely compelling and interesting. But at the end of the day, he also, is not ever interested in insisting upon a particular interpretation. And I think the thing that he does, which is extraordinarily strategic, is to set up a way of understanding his art that invites the spectator in, and he really does legitimate I think he legitimates virtually any interpretation of his work. I think by doing that, he knows he's setting up a dynamic, and he recognized that in order for any artist or any work of art to maintain its validity, it had to be seen by spectators. He knew that there had to be this process of an audience. And so if we think about performativity as always involving some type of idea or appreciation of spectatorship, I think Duchamp's work is extraordinarily performative, in large part because he was invested in making sure that it would stay relevant forever. I think that's why he was thinking so mindfully of audiences, as he put it, 50 years or 100 years hence. He wanted to set up a dynamic so that even the spectator would feel that they were a part of this game somehow. And I do think his comfort with collaboration is a large part of that. And I actually think it's an aspect of his work that probably has not been sufficiently investigated in and of itself, but I think it's extraordinarily important. Yeah.
I have a question that's, I think, related, but still a little bit different. And first, thank you all for those great papers. My question is more about agency of subjects and sitters in portraits. And it's sparked by something that Anne said, or the way that you treated some of Duchamp's portraits within your talk, that he wasn't the artist to which it was attributed, but you talked but you talked about him as the maker in some sense, or having that control, or being a large part of it. And I realized that it's a thread throughout your projects, this artist as subject, even when they're not necessarily the photographer or the maker of the object we're looking at. And I sensed a kind of license to assume their power in shaping the image, even when they weren't its maker. And I wonder why we might be able to attribute that agency to them more readily than other portrait subjects. And a lot of the talks over the conference have been about subjects that had far less agency over their image. And I wonder if you feel like there's reason to kind of combine some of the way that you're talking about these artists and images with those subjects, or to address them more actively as makers in images than we tend to do as art historians.
Just to sort of start off the response to that, because I think there'll be a lot to be said about that question. I think that Duchamp was actively engaging through conversations with people who are making his portrait. And one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about that actually has to do with an exhibition that I am fortunate the National Portrait Gallery was generous enough to support in 2009 that looked at portraits of Duchamp. And having looked at a lot of portraits of him, I came to realize there were patterns in the representation of Duchamp across a broad range of artists that made it quite obvious that they were somehow, without even realizing it, hewing to some ideas that he was probably putting out to them fairly subtly. But to your point about this issue of agency and power dynamics, I think that is an extremely interesting thing to look at. I will say, in terms of the way that the history of art has tended to be written, I think that we still embrace a culture of authorship in a sort of traditional sense. So I actually think the framework of the discipline itself makes it a little bit difficult to describe collaborative authorship. I think we're getting a little bit better, but there's a long history, especially where couples are concerned, of the men getting credit for a long time, and then eventually it shifts and two partners get credit for a particular product. And I think in a funny way we see a residue of that in how Duchamp's representation has been treated. With good reason, Arnold Newman gets credit for a photograph, or Man Ray, but actually if one goes back and looks at the making of that image, it probably is more appropriate to credit it as a collaborative act, a performative act. And while there are some very compelling reasons, I think, in terms of Duchamp's own history and frankly his own comfort with collaboration that make it easy to make the case for somebody like him, what I think becomes really exciting is, as you sort of, I think, suggest with your comment, as we begin to look at it in the case of a specific artist like Duchamp, I think it opens up the opportunity to realize that portraiture in particular is a genre that is almost always about some type of a relationship, some type of a power dynamic, and some type of a collaborative exchange. And to start to think about that dynamic, I think becomes a really exciting way of opening up portraiture as an art form that gives some really interesting insight into the relationship of the maker of record, the subject of record, the relationship to one another, but also their larger relationship, with a particular social political context. So those are just ruminations sparked by your observation, which I really like, and I'll continue to meditate on it. But Shipu and Erin may also have thoughts.
Well, it's something that I was wondering too. I think with photography we have a clearer sense of the amount of time two people spent together, and a sense of the sort of position of a camera at least and another person. So some elements in that collaborative negotiation of portraiture become a little bit clearer. But certainly, commissioned portraits, whether they're painted or sculpted or anything, there is this give and take between the person making them and the person who's represented. And I think that the question of agency, it might be written into contracts for earlier work, but it's always a source of interest. And I think maybe photography has the potential to shed light or make more transparent this kind of social interaction that's at the core of portraiture always.
I would just say that for Matsuura especially, when I discovered that a lot of the Native American communities in the region chose to go to his studio to have their portraits taken. It wasn't as if he was as Curtis did, right, going into different communities and trying to, quote unquote, preserve their culture. They chose to go to his studio, and in that process, he allowed them to decide how they wanted to appear in front of his camera, and that's the kind of agency that you can see in the pictures, and that tells us something different about that particular town and the interaction between different ethnic communities that produce a sort of nuance to the narrative of the frontier and photography, for that matter.
Hello. Well, thank you for all of your talks. Something that I was really struck by in hearing all three of these together was the idea, the destabilizing of identity in photography, both in terms of intention of the photographer or the interpretation of art historians. And something I was kind of waiting for was the idea of the index to be brought up, meaning that photography as a process records something that is true in life, and we can point to that record and say this happened. And the ways that these artists all interfered with that in such a way to destabilize the identities of themselves or of their sitters. And it seems that when the camera acts, even in a documentary setting, it's telling the truth. But when we twist, or when the artists subvert this and destabilize the identity, the camera is still telling the truth even when it's lying. And I wanted to just ask you, in context of digital technologies. Now we can, there's a sense that we have lost some sort of faith in the index, that we have lost some kind of true connection between reality and the photograph and digital technology. So that's not really a question. I just wanted to ask you to reflect on that and comment on that.
Right. I think that's an amazing question, particularly in the 21st century, for us to think about. In what ways do we continue to believe photographs tell us the truth? And I think we still do, even though I think we all think we're more savvy viewers than when we look backwards at historical viewers. I'm not sure that we really, that our perspective on photography has changed that much, because there's still always this tendency to believe what we see in photographic images. And I think that the idea of index in these portraits that have been sort of tampered with or manipulated, I agree with you. We're still seeing something true even when the photographs are lying. But I think it's a matter of expectation for historians. What truths do we expect to see, and what things are we taking for granted, maybe? And then how can we try to look at the truths or the reality or the situation that the photographs are actually presenting? So I think one of the things that I thought was the interesting overlap in the talks about studio portraiture was how was this kind of space between the real and the imaginative necessary, either for personal transformation or for fostering an idea of art-making potential. And I think for Cerrone, it was really important to kind of break apart existing rhetoric of the time that had to do with photographic truth in order to open up space for the possibility of photography as something imaginative and artistic. And it had the added benefit of allowing him to sort of create this public persona for himself, and to kind of live this larger than life self through photography too. So it was a kind of stage or a platform in that way.
I would just say that I'm not quite sure if photography always had the credentials as being true even from the very beginning, right? And coming to this contemporary moment as I teach students, they are very suspicious of all the pictures that they see, because they know they manipulate their own selfies when they put them out there. So that's a sort of ingrained understanding of there's always a shifting between it being true as a capturing one moment and the other one being manipulated to some extent. And so I find fascinating in Mazura's case was that people were able to forget that for a moment and appear in carefree ways in front of his camera. And I have to assume that they keep copies of those photographs. We know certain copies are given to the sitters, and that's a recording of the moment that they remember they're hanging out. It could be a session after they had an outing and they stopped at his studio to take the pictures, and that's a record of that moment, and after that they have new sessions.
It's really, I think this question of the relationship between the picture, the index, and meaning is extremely interesting, and certainly it was something that Duchamp loved disrupting. He loved teasing us and reminding us that what we thought was true maybe wasn't true, and that our eyes perhaps were deceiving us. But I think it actually comes back to maybe a point that Jonathan Waltz made at the end of the last panel when he raised this question about whether an official passport-like photograph really constitutes a portrait or not. And I think it also gets back to this issue of agency, political power, what are the circumstances under which an image is made. And Duchamp's Wanted poster, which is made in 1923, sort of, I think, deliberately seeks to undermine the political authority of the image as a marker of power. And he actually has a very, very interesting life story. He comes to the US during World War I because he's not able to go to the front. He has to basically escape from Europe during World War II. So I think Duchamp is deeply aware of what passports mean, what other sorts of official documents mean, and I think he does develop a form of representation that seeks to undermine that type of authority. And I think I see that in Matsura's work too, that these may be photographs, but they are definitely escaping the eye of, it seems, political authority, which seems actually very commensurate with the American West, where people may have gone precisely because they were not interested in being part of, the power establishment in the East. So I think it's a fascinating question about indexicality, control, and interpretation.
I have something to throw in for all of you, and feel free to interject with a question on your own, and of course for the three speakers. That relates to the idea of what is the relationship between truth in portraiture and the size of your audience. Meaning that if you have a smaller audience, if you know you're taking a selfie, I'm using a selfie, but just bear with me. If you're taking a selfie that you know you're only going to show to your partner, is that somehow more of a genuine representation of your inner character? Whereas if you're taking a selfie that, say, Kim Kardashian knows will be, dispersed to millions, is that an artifice? Is that somehow less genuine? And I think that, Clemens obviously seemed to get more and more agitated the more he knew that this image was being dispersed and consumed by many. So that's something for all of us to think about, this relationship between the size of our audience and the truth.
Well, to throw into that,
Yes.
makes the first viewer is yourself. So if you're making a selfie, so how you look at yourself has all the psychological and different implications. So the fact that, coming back to my topic, so the fact that Matsura was so conscious in playing different races as well, so in that picture where he puts on the Indian trade blanket, was to see himself through a different representation. And it's both an experimentation, but for me, it's also an intervention in the political discourse at the time of the treatment of Native Americans.
Absolutely.
And so that became, while he may not completely intended that to be that statement, it becomes a powerful image for that.
I think this touches back on the Q&A session from the last panel, talking about dissemination of images, and I think particularly what Richard said about there being an inherent kind of authority in the selfie image, that once it's dispersed, we know that there was a choice made on the part of the maker to put it out, because how many photos were taken before that where, I look funny or something, and you delete those and then send out this one. So there's this selection, or at least in the digital era, with a selfie image. But I think the issues of publicity and privacy and official images and unofficial images comes into all of this too. So I guess that gets to your question about size of audience, or perhaps control of audience, or the ability to kind of contain who gets to see something and who gets to see a representation of a person.
It is interesting that famously people are scared if they look like the picture in their license. There's this sense, I think, actually, that virtually nobody probably puts their passport image on their Christmas card. And we tend, I think, to resist identifying ourselves in a very personal way with photographic representations that have been dictated to us by authority. And I find that sort of interesting, that there seems to be a need, at least to perceive, that we have disrupted some convention in order to give a sense of personal, something of our personality, something personal
Going
about the image.
beyond likeness to get at something deeper.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about Samuel Clemens and Cerrone in this issue of, sorry, I don't want to cut off a question, but this issue of control and the question of who did have authority over that image.
Right.
And it seems like maybe the discomfort grew out of the fact that perhaps Clemens came to feel that Cerrone was controlling his image, as opposed to Clemens having control over who Mark Twain was. And that is an interesting paradox.
Right. I think who has the power to disseminate and to kind of claim authorship a likeness or a portrait image. And that was the battle that they were sort of locked in, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that they each should be standard bearers for different copyright disputes, actually.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talks today. I mean, the whole symposium has been amazing. The Cerrone paper, I saw your earlier iteration of another chapter of this project, and I'm just so floored by it, and I'm like loving where it's going.
Thank you.
My question is for Shibu, because I'm like, where has Matsuda been all my life? Like, I feel like there's this gaping hole in my art historical training. I was like, why is he not an intimate part of my education? And like, I'm fascinated when you're showing his images. I think of Robin Cohen on diaspora and the concept of like going away from homeland to make homeland in different ways in your adopted homeland. So either through memories that you bring or through the embodied culture or like sharing of memories and kind of having this psychogeographic migration experience that's mapped onto the new space. And I also think of Richard Rodriguez on making queer familia. And so like the idea of the chosen queer family is a more empowered kinship structure beyond the arbitrariness of a biological kinship structure. It's just kind of like, you're connected via DNA, but you didn't choose for these folks to be your parents or your cousins or your siblings. So I wonder if you think of Matsuda as making home or queer familia through this in Washington, through this documentation of these queer kinship structures, because especially in like the images that kind of push against like heteronormative structures of interrelation, he's playing all the different roles, and some of them can be like, I look at them like, oh, like partners or siblings or other sorts of very intimate relations. That's not just friendship, but to me I'm like, oh, it's his chosen family, and kind of like documenting it, especially that you emphasize he's the only Japanese immigrant in the area. So I wonder in his experience as being in a sense singular, but having this constant documentation of he's not alone, he has all these folks as kind of like, I have my family, I've made my family, I've chosen my family in this new homeland.
Yeah, if you want to find him, you can find photo murals all over town in Okanagan. You can look it up, you can see them. But I think that's a very shrewd strategy on his part, because he came from a well-off family background that he was able to bring purchase the equipment. So there was a gift from his aunt for $300 at the time. So he was able to use that as a way to also engage the local community, and through photography, through offering portraiture as a communication tool almost, right? And so that's what's fascinating about photographic portraiture, or portraiture in general, is that kind of interaction and that shifting between the subject and the maker of that. And you see that a lot of in his pictures.
Hello. I actually am also fascinated by, I'm way back here. Hi. I'm also fascinated by the discovery of Matsuda and appreciate that and see lots of overlaps between you all. But that question about publicity and privacy really strikes me, and I'm wondering if there were any consequences, as we were listening to the Mark Twain consequences, or Samuel Clemens, consequences of those photos going beyond the subject's private ownership. I'm thinking of the truths of the 1800s for people of color, for women, for same-sex communities, and wondering, you described that studio as a playful and judgment-free space, yes? And so in any of your pieces, were there consequences for those? Do you know? I was just curious, what would happen if other people saw these pictures beyond the people who were involved in the taking? Does that make sense?
So those stamp-sized photographs, what we know about them, they are circulated among the friends who participate in those sessions. He did produce other portraits where he would make postcards out of them. So one of the Native Americans' portraits was sold in the store, and one of the pictures actually showed that on the wall. So there's both a sort of private sharing and also public sharing. I think it also, to answer that question, you have to consider the context. That town there, you're mentioning, so the homesteaders, especially women who came out from the East, and I cited some literature in my essay, written essay, that they wanted to escape certain restriction of how they should live. So going into that environment, they already have a different mindset to some extent, albeit there are still external restrictions. That photographic studio provided that escape, that space, and in turn, as the town people got to know more about what they were producing, maybe then they started to loosen up a little bit and participate.
I find that fascinating, given I'm just thinking of the historical moment of what the 1800s meant, right? As a black woman, I'm like, wow, right? Or thinking of even same-sex relationships and how folks really were in lots of, just thinking of how that seems like such an oasis in that space. And I just remain fascinated that there were no seemingly negative consequences. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia. Thank you. Speaking of oasis, we are going to conclude our panel discussion, and you're all invited on behalf of Kim Sayet, the director of the National Portrait Gallery, to join us upstairs in the courtyard for refreshments. As she would say, as Kim would say, there is wine in your future, should you so please. But before we go, I would like to give a hearty round of applause for our wonderful speakers. Thank you. Thank you. And also to the wonderful Jackie Petito for all of her efforts. Kate LeMay, the director of Portal, and our historian. And of course, our editor, our wonderful editor, Wendy Wick-Reeves. Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you, everybody. See you upstairs.